Part 1. The studio. I never thought I'd be working in a place like this. The building was ancient, creaking with the weight of years long past, but for a fashion designer in New York City, space like this doesn't come cheap. The location was perfect, right in the heart of Manhattan, and the price? Unheard of. My business partner warned me about the building's history, how it was the site of one of the deadliest fires in the city, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911. But I wasn't one to believe in ghosts or curses. At least not until that first night. It started innocently enough. I was alone, sewing late into the evening, trying to get a prototype ready for a meeting the next day. The sewing machine hummed steadily under my fingers, and I barely noticed the hours slipping by. It wasn't until a sudden chill swept through the room that I paused. I glanced up, confused, expecting to see an open window, but everything was shut tight. The air felt wrong, heavy, oppressive, like it was weighing down on me. I shook it off and went back to work. The machine clicked along smoothly, the sound comforting in the stillness of the night. Then, out of nowhere, it stopped. The needle jammed mid-stitch, the motor whirring uselessly. I tried to move it, to fix the thread, but the machine felt locked in place, frozen under my hands. Frustrated, I stood to check the wiring, and that's when I saw it. A handprint. Dark, greasy, and unmistakably fresh, smeared across the edge of the work table. I stared at it, my mind scrambling for an explanation. I hadn't touched anything with oil or grease. No one else had been in the studio. Before I could process what I was seeing, the lights flickered once, twice, then plunged the room into darkness. My heart pounded as I fumbled for my phone, using its light to find the nearest switch. The shadows around me seemed to stretch and twist, distorting in ways that made my skin crawl. When I finally reached the switch and flipped it back on, the light sputtered back to life, but the handprint was gone. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, the stress of opening a new business. But as I turned back to the sewing machine, the floor creaked behind me. I froze. Someone was in the room with me. Slowly I turned, my breath catching in my throat. No one. The room was empty, but the air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't explain. And then I heard it, faint at first, like a low whisper. "Help me!" It was barely audible, like it was coming from the walls themselves. I stepped back, my pulse racing, eyes scanning every corner of the room. The whisper came again, clearer this time, louder, pleading. "Help! Us!" I spun around, searching for the source, and that's when I saw them. Shadows. Dozens of them. Faint outlines of figures standing just beyond the reach of the light, their forms flickering as if they weren't quite real. My stomach lurched as I realized what I was seeing. These weren't just shadows. They were people. Or they had been. The sewing machine suddenly roared back to life, needle stabbing into the fabric with unnatural speed, the motor shrieking like it was going to explode. I stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of fabric bolts, my hand shaking as I tried to process what was happening. The whispering grew louder, the voices overlapping now, desperate, panicked. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. I yanked on the handle, twisted it, pounded on the wood, but it was locked. From the outside? My panic rose as I threw my weight against it, trying to force it open, but it was no use. And then I smelled it. Smoke. Thick and acrid, curling through the cracks in the floorboards and seeping from the walls. My throat tightened as I realized what was happening. The air around me grew hotter, suffocating, and I could hear the faint crackle of flames. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the smoke, the heat, it was all too vivid, too intense to be a hallucination. As I turned toward the window, I saw them again. The shadows. No longer just shapes in the corners, they were moving, crawling across the walls and floor, coming toward me. Their faces began to emerge from the darkness, twisted in pain and terror, their eyes hollow, their skins scorched and blistered. They were the victims, the ones who had died here, trapped behind locked doors in that factory fire over a century ago. And now they were here. With me, Dot. The smoke thickened, swirling around me in thick clouds as I coughed and stumbled toward the window, desperate for fresh air. But the window wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pushed, it was sealed shut, just like the door. The heat was unbearable now. Sweat poured down my face as the flames grew closer, licking at the walls, hungrily consuming everything in their path. I could hear the screams now, faint but unmistakable. The same screams that had echoed through this building over 100 years ago. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest, and then I saw them. Hands. Dozens of them, blackened and burned, reaching out from the walls, clawing toward me. Their nails scraped against the wood, leaving deep gouges as they tried to pull themselves free. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the roar of the fire. And then in the center of the room, I saw it. a figure standing perfectly still amidst the chaos. Its skin was charred and cracked, its face half melted, but its eyes were locked on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, its burned feet leaving smoldering marks on the floor. I backed away, my body trembling, but there was nowhere to go. The fire had surrounded me, and the shadows were closing in. The last thing I heard before everything was swallowed by flame was a voice, low and guttural, whispering in my ear. "You will burn with us." Part 2. The Flames. The next morning, I woke up on the floor of the studio, my clothes soaked in sweat. The door was unlocked, the windows unsealed. No smoke, no fire, no shadows. Just silence and the faint hum of the city outside. I should have felt relieved, but something was wrong. My hands were shaking, my body aching in ways I couldn't explain. As I stood up, my legs nearly gave out beneath me. My eyes scanned the room for any sign of what happened the night before. Nothing. No charred walls, no burned fabric, not even a faint smell of smoke. It was like the entire experience had been wiped away, erased. But I knew what I had seen. The shadows, the whispers, the flames, those burned hands clawing at the walls. I wasn't imagining it. My phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a message from my business partner. I forced myself to read it through the pounding in my head. "How's the new place? Settled in yet? Asterisk, asterisk." I stared at the words for what felt like an eternity before typing a response. I didn't mention the fire or the figures. Instead, I gave a simple answer. "It's fine. Asterisk, asterisk, fine." As if the studio wasn't filled with the restless spirits of people who had died screaming. The day moved slowly. I tried to work, to focus on my designs, but every time I looked up, I thought I saw something. A shadow darting in the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement just outside my vision. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. Every gust of air from the vents made my skin prickle with dread. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be. But that night, when I found myself alone again in the studio, the air grew heavy. Oppressive. The kind of weight that presses down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. I checked the windows. Locked. I checked the door. Secure. And yet, that creeping coldness returned, the same icy chill I felt the night before. I sat at my work table, trying to ignore it, focusing on my sewing, but the needle in my hand trembled. I told myself to keep going, keep working, but the shadows, they were back. I could feel them behind me, watching, waiting. I refused to look. The sewing machine jammed again, the fabric snarling up into a mess of tangled thread. But before I could react, the machine jerked to life. My fingers were too close to the needle, and with a sickening asterisk, thunk asterisk, it stabbed through the tip of my finger. Blood pooled on the fabric, but I barely registered the pain. I was too busy listening. It started as a low hum, like static buzzing in my ears. Then the whispers began again, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the walls surrounding me. "Burn. With us." My heart hammered in my chest as I stood up, clutching my bleeding hand. I turned toward the sound, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway. At first, I thought it was someone breaking in. I wanted it to be someone breaking in. Anything to explain away the fear bubbling up inside me. But the longer I stared, the more I realized this wasn't someone from the outside. It was one of them. The figure was just a silhouette in the dim light, its body impossibly thin, arms hanging limply at its sides. The face was in shadow, but I didn't need to see it. I already knew what I'd find. A charred, twisted visage of agony, eyes burned away by the fire. The air grew thick with smoke again, and I coughed, backing away from the door. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there staring at me, or at least I imagined it was staring. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't be here." Its voice was like dry leaves scraping against pavement, barely human. I couldn't respond. My mouth had gone dry, my limbs frozen in place. The smoke began to curl around the room, thick and suffocating, just like the night before. I tried to move, to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The figure took a step forward, and with each movement, the air around me seemed to grow hotter. The smell of burning fabric filled the room, and I glanced down to see flames licking at the edges of my work table, spreading faster than they should have. But it wasn't the fire that terrified me most. It was the hands. They were back, crawling up from the floorboards, clawing at the walls. Dozens of blackened hands, fingers twisted and broken, pulling themselves free from the charred wood. I gasped in horror as they began reaching for me, their nails scratching and dragging across the floor, leaving deep gouges in the wood. The figure in the doorway tilted its head, as if watching in amusement. "You'll burn too." The fire roared to life around me, the heat searing my skin, but I barely felt it. All I could see were the hands, those grotesque, smoldering hands closing in on me from every direction. And then, with a sudden jolt, the door slammed shut behind the figure, trapping me inside. Panic surged through me as I raced to the window, yanking at the lock, but just like before, it wouldn't budge. I slammed my fists against the glass, screaming for help, but the only answer was the crackle of flames and the scratching of those horrible hands, now pulling themselves toward me faster, their charred faces emerging from the darkness, mouths open in silent screams. My vision blurred with smoke and heat, my lungs burned with each breath, and then from the depths of the fire I saw something worse. A second figure. No, not a figure. Figures. More of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all burned beyond recognition, crawling out of the walls, emerging from the floor. They surrounded me, their mouths opening and closing in unison, and as the flames consumed everything around me, they whispered again, "You will burn with us." Before I could react, I felt a searing pain across my arm, and I looked down to see one of the blackened hands clutching me, its nails digging into my flesh. I screamed, trying to pull away, but it held on, dragging me toward the center of the room. The fire was everywhere now, the heat unbearable, and all around me, the voices of the dead whispered, laughed, screamed. The room began to spin, the air thick with smoke, and the last thing I saw before everything went dark was the glint of flames reflecting in their hollow, lifeless eyes. Then silence. When I awoke, the studio was untouched. No fire, no smoke. But the deep gouges left by those hands remain. Part 3. The unseen. I didn't go back to the studio for days. I couldn't. Every time I thought about it, the smell of smoke filled my nose. The heat of those invisible flames pricked at my skin, and the memory of those charred hands gripping my arm haunted me. I'd run my fingers over the spot where they had grabbed me, expecting to find marks. But my skin was smooth, unblemished. Yet the pain still lingered. My business partner called, asking why I hadn't shown up. I made excuses, sick, overworked, dealing with something personal. But deep down, I knew that sooner or later I'd have to go back. There was no avoiding it. When I finally did return, I was different. Fear clung to me like a second skin, every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside making my heart jump in my chest. I approached the building slowly, staring up at its cold brick facade. The windows seemed darker than usual, the shadows inside pressing against the glass, watching, waiting for me to come back. The door groaned as I pushed it open. Inside, everything was exactly how I'd left it, except for one detail. The gouges. They were still there, deep scratches marring the floorboards, leading from the far corner of the room to the spot where I'd collapsed. I stared at them, my stomach churning as if looking at proof of something I couldn't explain. I bent down, running my hand over the grooves. They were jagged, uneven, like claws had been dragged across the wood. My fingers trembled as I touched them, but then I felt something else, a cold, wet sensation. Blood. Fresh, glistening drops of blood. I pulled my hand back, horror washing over me. There was no source, no explanation, but the blood was real. I wiped it off, trying to tell myself it was my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. I wasn't alone. The studio seemed to close in on me as I stood, the walls pressing tighter, the air growing heavy again. A strange feeling settled in the pit of my stomach, like I was being watched. My eyes darted around the room, expecting to see those shadows again, but they weren't there. Not yet. The door slammed behind me and I jumped, spinning around to see nothing. The air shifted, the atmosphere thickening with tension, and the familiar scent of smoke began to waft through the air again. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but it was no use. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out while I still could. But I had to know. I had to find out what was happening. I approached the work table, the needle of the sewing machine still embedded in the fabric from the last time I'd touched it. As I reached out to pull the needle free, a gust of cold air swept through the room, sending shivers down my spine. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a reflection in the window, a faint outline of someone standing behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. My breath came in short gasps, my pulse pounding in my ears. The reflection was still there, though, and I couldn't stop myself from looking back. This time I didn't turn around. The figure stood at the far end of the room, shrouded in shadow, its features obscured. But I knew. I knew it was one of them. One of the souls trapped in this place, waiting for their revenge. Waiting for me. And then, as I stared, it moved. Not fast, not in a rush, but slow, deliberate steps. Each movement brought the figure closer, and as it came into the light, I saw it clearly for the first time. The flesh was charred, the clothes melted into its skin, its face twisted in eternal agony. It wasn't just a ghost. It was the embodiment of the fire that had consumed them, and now it was coming for me. My feet were rooted to the spot, frozen in terror as the figure approached. The smell of burning flesh filled the room, so intense it made my stomach turn. Its eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, locked onto mine, and I knew there was no escaping. The whispering returned, louder this time, circling around me like a storm. "Burn with us! Burn with us!" I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but before I could take another step, something grabbed my ankle. I looked down to see those hands, those cursed, blackened hands, crawling up from the floor again, pulling me toward the center of the room. I screamed, thrashing against their grip, but they were stronger than before. The figure loomed closer, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, and I could feel the heat rising around me, the air thick with smoke. My vision blurred, my body drenched in cold sweat, as the walls seemed to warp and bend around me. The whole room was changing, shifting into something else. Something older. The walls were no longer the brick of a modern building. They were wood. Ancient splintered wood. I was no longer in my studio. I was in the factory. I heard them, the screams. The frantic cries of workers trapped behind locked doors, the roar of the fire as it tore through everything in its path. The heat was unbearable now, the flames licking at my skin as I was dragged across the floor. Through the smoke and chaos, I saw them, dozens of figures, their bodies charred, their eyes hollow, reaching out toward me. They were all around me, closing in, suffocating me with their presence. The figure reached down, its burned hand brushing my cheek, the heat searing my flesh. I screamed again, the sound lost in the roar of the fire, and then it stopped. The hands released me, the flames vanished, and I was back in my studio. But the figures were still there, standing in a circle around me, silent, watching. Their empty eyes bore into me, and for the first time I understood. They weren't just here to haunt me, they were here to punish me. I had disturbed their resting place. I had brought my business into the sight of their suffering, and now they wanted justice. But it wasn't over. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and in the silence I heard a voice. Not a whisper this time, but clear, strong. "You'll never leave." The room trembled, the walls groaning under some unseen pressure. And then I realized I was trapped asterisk. This wasn't just a haunting. This was a prison, and I was their prisoner. Part 4. The escapee stood there, surrounded by the charred figures, the cold weight of their stares pressing down on me. The realization that I was trapped with them, trapped in their nightmare, settled into my bones. But as the room seemed to darken, as the walls groaned and the flames threatened to return, something inside me stirred. I wasn't going to let this end like this. I'd seen enough, heard enough to understand that these souls didn't want me. They wanted justice, recognition, something more than to be remembered as a footnote in history. They were trapped in their own torment, reliving the fire over and over, and they needed someone to help them break free. With trembling hands, I forced myself to speak, even though my voice came out shaky and weak. "I understand. I know why you're here. I'm sorry." The figures shifted slightly, their hollow eyes still locked onto me, but something about their movements changed. They weren't advancing anymore. They were listening. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "You were forgotten, and that was wrong. You were left to suffer, and no one did anything to stop it. But I know now. I know the truth, and I'll make sure others do too. I'll remember your names." The air grew still, as if the entire room was holding its breath. "I can help you," I said softly, my voice trembling with the weight of the moment. "I'll make sure the world never forgets what happened here. I'll tell your story. You don't have to be trapped anymore." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The shadows flickered, the figures standing still, their eyes still fixed on me. The smoke that had threatened to choke me moments before seemed to thin, the acrid scent fading. Then, from the center of the group, one figure moved forward. It was the same one I had seen before, the one whose charred face had haunted my dreams. Its hollow eyes were still there, its burned skin still clinging to its bones, but there was something different in the way it stood. Something softer, almost peaceful. "You will remember us?" the voice rasped, still rough and broken, but less terrifying now. Almost hopeful. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I promise. I'll tell the world about you, about what happened here. I won't let anyone forget." The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering my words. The other figures remained still, watching, waiting. The tension in the room began to ease, the oppressive weight lifting just slightly. And then the figure spoke again. "Thank you." With those two words, the air changed. The coldness that had clung to the room began to dissipate, replaced by a warmth. Not the searing heat of the fire, but something gentler, like the first rays of sunlight after a long, dark night. The figures around me began to fade, their twisted forms growing more transparent with each passing second. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat as the figure in front of me, the one who had spoken, slowly dissolved into the air. The smoke cleared, the darkness lifted, and the shadows that had haunted me for days melted away like mist in the morning light. The room was quiet, peaceful. I stood there, stunned, unsure of what had just happened. The gouges in the floor had vanished. The sewing machine was silent. The cold, the heat, the smoke, it was all gone. All that remained was the echo of those final words. "Thank you," I exhaled, a wave of relief washing over me. The studio felt different now. Warmer. Almost inviting. The building that had once felt like a tomb now felt alive, as if something had been released, something long overdue. I sat down at my work table, my heart still racing, but this time it wasn't fear that filled me. It was hope. I had been given a second chance, both for myself and for them. In the days that followed, I kept my promise. I researched the names of every worker who had died in that fire. I wrote their stories, shared their lives with the world, told the truth about the tragedy that had claimed them. The history books had reduced them to numbers, but I made sure they were remembered as individuals, as people with hopes, dreams, and families. And with every story I told, the studio felt a little lighter. The coldness never returned. The shadows never reappeared. One evening, after another long day of work, I stood by the window, looking out over the city. The sun was setting, casting the streets in a golden light. For the first time since I'd moved in, I felt at peace. And as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the skyline, I saw something in the reflection of the glass. A figure. But this time it wasn't menacing. It wasn't burned or broken. It was a young woman, her face soft and kind, her eyes bright and full of life. She smiled at me, a gentle, knowing smile, before fading away into the evening. They were free now. And so was I.